Hello, I'm Jay Hirsch, Director of Administration of Columbia's ERM program. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, CRO Spotlight Series with featured CRO Philip Sherrill. I'd like to tell you about some of our upcoming events. On all Thursdays, we have our Exploring the Power of Mindfulness seminars. On Fridays, we have our Coding for ERM seminars. And on Saturdays, we have our IQRM seminars. On October 5th, we have a panel on the promise and perils of quantum computing. October 20th is our next CRO Spotlight, this one featuring Lakshmi Shyam Sunder of World Bank Group. And on November 3rd, we have a panel on operational risk and resilience. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Sim Segal, founder and director of the ERM program at Columbia and president of Symergy Consulting. Sim.
Thank you, Jay. And I want to welcome all of you joining us today. So I'll now introduce myself and our featured guest. I'm Sim Segal. I'm founder and director of the ERM program here at Columbia University. Excuse me. The largest such program globally. I'm also president of Symergy, an ERM consulting firm I founded about 11 years ago, based in Manhattan, helping organizations advance their ERM across all sectors. I'm author of an ERM book published by Wiley called Corporate Value of Enterprise Risk Management, which I wrote for chief risk officers to help advance their ERM programs, but it's also been adopted as required reading on the syllabi of the Society of Actuaries, excuse me, which is my chosen profession. I'm an actuary by trade. It's the world's oldest risk profession. And it's also been adopted by leading universities in such countries as the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, China, where it's been translated into Chinese, Italy, Croatia, and Egypt. And as I learned fairly recently at a client, also Jamaica. It's my honor now to introduce our featured guest, Chief Risk Officer, Philip Sherrill. Philip Sherrill serves as Senior Vice President, Enterprise Risk Management and Chief Risk Officer for Arkansas Public Prosecutor Shield, ABCBS, in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he has spent the last 28 years of his career. He is responsible for facilitating the company's enterprise risk management process and its integration into strategic market and business planning. He works closely, with the company's leadership and its board of directors to assess and manage a wide range of key and emerging risks influencing the organization and its strategy. Sherrill works with a dedicated team of leaders to enhance the effectiveness of the company's overall internal control structure, strengthen its corporate and regulatory compliance posture, and drive payment integrity disciplines focused on fraud, waste, and abuse across the healthcare system. Prior to his current role, he served as Vice President of Internal Control and Reporting, and he continues to serve as the company's Chief Audit Executive. Sherrill received degrees in accounting and computer information systems from Harding University in 1988 and joined ABCBS after spending 5 years as an auditor with KPMG. Sherrill is a certified public accountant, a certified internal auditor, and a certified health insurance executive through America's health insurance plans. He is a member of the American Institute of, Certified Public Accountants, the Arkansas Society of Certified Public Accountants, and the Institute of Internal Auditors. Philip, welcome to the CRO Spotlight.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I wanted to just apologize in advance. I'll be taking notes. It just helps me focus listening while you're answering the questions we have for you today. Before we start with the enterprise risk management questions, I thought it'd be good if you could just give an overview of ABCBS to our audience.
Be happy to. Just at a high level, we are the largest health insurance carrier in the state of Arkansas. We're privileged to serve right about 1.8 million members, and that's within the state of Arkansas and across the nation, because we have members for large accounts that live in all states. We offer a wide range of products. We're actually a not-for-profit mutual insurance company rather than a for-profit, which basically says that our policyholders, our members, are actually our owners rather than stockholders. And so to that end, the results of our operations and the things that we do, we turn it back and leverage it to help improve affordability for our members and try to hopefully influence and improve their health status. So we're privileged to get to operate in this industry, and we've been very pleased to do that for over 70 years.
Thank you for that overview, and thank you again for taking the time to do this. I know you're very busy.
Oh, it's my honor.
I wanted to start out sort of at the beginning with what was the initial impetus that launched your enterprise risk management program?
Well, the health insurance industry, if you're watching the news at all, for any time over the past 10 years, you'll know that the health insurance industry and healthcare in general has been a very turbulent world. There have been so many changes. The Affordable Care Act, when it was implemented and went live in 2013, 2014, the expansion of our government's interest in looking at how they can help to improve the healthcare status and the financing for citizens in the U.S. Just so many things, the advancements in technology, all these things really created a ground swirl, not a ground swell, but a ground swirl within our industry. And for us, we had what I would term as an informal ERM process more than anything. Like all organizations, we manage risk. We just didn't really do it on a formalized basis. And so the changes that were happening in industry and add to that the fact that our own governance bodies, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, had really identified the need to formalize enterprise risk management within our industry. And so we responded to that call from our regulators and implemented a formal program, but we weren't satisfied just to do it as a compliance exercise. We didn't want to just check the box. We were really interested in having a program that made a difference. If we were going to implement something, let's do it for the purposes of its value and how it could contribute to the organization as a whole. And so as a result, in 2016, I was privileged to get to help launch our formal program.
Thank you for that. So let's start with the first process cycle step, risk identification. Within that, can you describe how you conduct your qualitative risk assessments within risk identification?
There are a lot of different ways to go about it, obviously. And I think there's a lot of schools of thought out there with regards to different methods. Personally, I'm a believer in face-to-face interviews. I prefer to sit down and sit across the table from someone and have an opportunity to interact, to hear what they have to say, to see their body language, to be able to ask clarifying questions. Surveys, we do use surveys at different points in the process, but very limited use for very specific reasons. It's hard to get clarified answers and to work through nuances of understanding just with the survey. In fact, we're so dedicated, quite frankly, to the face-to-face process that even through the pandemic, we really didn't Zoom those meetings. We masked and socially distanced, even if we had to sit 12 feet away from each other. We were in the same room and trying to exchange information in that way. And so we're really a strong believer in that kind of face-to-face interaction. The other thing there too is really trying to help the individual who you're talking to think beyond just the particular subject matter that they may be an expert in. So getting them to think beyond just if they happen to be an IT professional, beyond just the notion of IT risk, and think about and gather their perspectives on the broader range of risks that might be influencing the organization that they would see from their chair. Every person that we interview has a different perspective, has a different line of sight. And so understanding and honoring that through the interview process and how we capture their feedback really gives us, I think, a richer content when we try to go about putting it all together and identifying the risks that come out of that process.
It's interesting you mentioned that belief in face-to-face. I'm a big believer in that as well. It's part of a first semester course in our program is Strategic Communications for Risk Professionals. And the first session is listening skills, and the second one is reading body language. We talk about the importance of doing that. So it's amazing that even through pandemic, you've got people in person, so you can really see all the communication that's taking place in the room. That's how important it is to you.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, from an ERM perspective, I have learned a tremendous amount over the past 5 years, in particular, as I've gone through this journey. This is not my background in trade, although to some degree it is, because as an auditor coming up through those through that type of a development path within the organization, I'm always taught to focus on risk, but not really in this way. And so it's been a learning process. Most of the time and attention is spent in information exchange and communication and clarification, not necessarily in the calculations. The calculations ultimately are foundational, but even there, it's the narrative that comes out of those calculations that really influences and provides the basis for leaders to think about risk and to evaluate strategic alternatives.
So, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that is something that, I believe in as well, and most chief risk officers that are advanced will say that over 50% of the job is communication. You got to have the right numbers, you got to have the right approach, you got to have the right methodology, but to be accurate. And it's even more important how you interchange with people and the communication. So it's something that I'm glad that our students and alums are hearing that message reinforced, because it's something that we stress in our program. You mentioned that during the QRAs, you work to get people to give risks from their area of expertise, but also to put on the hat of the entire enterprise. It's enterprise risk management. Think about others. Do you have any sitting back and looking at what you've gathered over the years? Do you find that there's often insights from people outside an area that have a better perspective of risks that may be going on in another part of your organization when they put on that outsider hat and think about risks? Or
it is interesting. With the pandemic, one of the things that I found very interesting was the shift. Like most organizations, we moved probably 90 to 95% of our workforce in about a week's time. We moved that group back in March, April of 2020 to a remote work setting, to their homes, without really anticipating or being prepared. But we did have the technology infrastructure because of forward thinking and plan and preparation, thinking hopefully from a risk perspective, we were prepared to be able to support that. But then all of a sudden, the risk makeup changed dramatically. And now your technology people aren't just thinking about the internal components of our network or of our data centers, but now all of a sudden they're turning to the operations leadership and saying, do you realize that all of a sudden the ability to operate and process claims is now much more dependent on AT&T? It's now much more dependent on the public infrastructure. And so what are the new contingencies and the new mitigations that you have to think through in order to continue to maintain business continuity in the event that you have a broader infrastructure interruption? How do you plan for that? Because we were very much, folks were in-house, folks were dependent on our local resources, but now we're much more dependent on a different set of resources. And they were able to bring that to operations and talk to them about the specific operational risks that created. And that created a different set of interactions and discussions from their perspective. And so it's not just the asking of questions outside of a person's subject matter. It's also ensuring that your process encourages communication across the organization between leaders about those different perspectives. And that's where socialization of all this information becomes so very important. Like any process, you can gather information and you can collect it and hold it, and it becomes its own silo if you're not careful. And so those types of interactions have to be encouraged and supported, facilitated by the process.
Yeah, since you mentioned, I want to follow up and ask about that. Of course, the pandemic is a real lesson for a lot of people about their enterprise risk management process. So you alluded to the fact that because you had a strong ERM process in place already, it allowed you to have foresight to be ready to shift to home under such an event, and you were able to do that successfully. Other organizations were more scrambling. In fact, we were very fortunate that one of our leaders in our school was very advanced in this, and we moved almost instantly online very successfully. In fact, he was consulting to other schools throughout the university because of our success. And one of our faculty who works at one of the leading banks in the United States said to me, he told the CEO, how come, Columbia moved so quickly online? We didn't even do it that fast. So some banks are not as fast at this. So I wanted to ask you, from your observations to other organizations that you're aware of that maybe were not as advanced with enterprise risk management, did it take them longer to shift? And also, you mentioned that once you did shift, having a process in place to be aware of, okay, there's an event which you can look at if you make a decision or you have an outside event. How does it change our key risk? What emerging risks are coming? And as you mentioned now, the shift of the operational risk and the speed of that, the agility of that. Can you comment on that?
So I think that part of our preparedness was because we were already in tune with the movement within industry around remote workforce, around the changes that were happening within generational perspectives of desires to be able to work remotely, of the ability to recruit to Central Arkansas. I mean, I don't want anyone to be shocked. The rest of the nation isn't just clamoring to get into and live in the state of Arkansas. And so sometimes it's difficult to recruit. And so being able to have a wider range of recruiting bases through remote workforce and capabilities actually becomes a mitigation to the risk of not being able to retain or acquire necessary talent. And so those different pieces, because we had them on the radar screen, because we had a program that allowed us to focus on those things, we had an infrastructure already devised and developed that we were able to lean on. And I think that's part of what ERM is ultimately intended to do. I've told people inside the organization, and this is maybe is more around risk appetite, which has always been a challenge, for us to be able to really articulate and get comfortable with our own risk appetite. But ultimately, when you think about the technologies and you think about how we define what we're trying to accomplish, we need to be able to simulate pain. And that's one of the things I've sold internally to our organization's leaders is if you lean on this process in an effective way, you don't have to wait until you're faced with that circumstance. You can anticipate it. You can simulate what the impacts might very well be and plan and be prepared to be able to respond. It may not always be the scenario you think you're going to have to respond to, though. In this particular case, I don't think anyone anticipated a global pandemic. And yet, because we had elements in place and we had thought through some of those potential challenges, we were able to be prepared for a wider range of unpredicted or lower likelihood events like a pandemic, and we were positioned effectively. And I would suggest that not all organizations were as fortunate as we were to be positioned where we were at that time.
Let me ask now if you can describe your approach to risk quantification, maybe also back up a little bit and talk about just your overall approach. And in full disclosure, we work together. And so if you could cover a little bit about the framework and then how your approach to how you quantify risks.
So I guess first and foremost, I would say it begins for me with the foundational thought process that all risks can be quantified. And that was something I had to learn coming into the process. There were things that I thought were actually risks that, as it turns out, they were impacts that were driven by other events. For example, what's the old saying? It takes you a lifetime to build a reputation, but about 5 minutes to destroy it. As an organization, you can have a reputational event of some sort that occurs. And if I turn to my leadership inside the organization and said, can you quantify the implications of that? A news article is released that's unfavorable, or or something of that nature. And I turn to them and say, how do we go about quantifying that? Initially, they would have said, don't really know. And then I might say something to the effect of, well, if our reputation is damaged, what happens in the marketplace? And based on that, if our reputation is damaged there, what's the implication to the members that we serve? Will we lose members? Will we fail to capture members in the future? Now, if I have some estimation of what my membership change might be, of those that I'm out there serving, now I can quantify that by translating that into revenue, by translating that into lost revenue or lost scale. I may have a business operation that's built on a certain expectation of having a number of members. And if my members significantly fall, now all of a sudden the expense base that I've got, I may not be able to cover it effectively with my incoming revenue. And so how do I go about managing that? So ultimately, I think we believe that anything can ultimately be quantified if you can translate it logically into the levers that we use within our risk model. And so that's what we try to do with our subject matter experts. We do try, when we identify risks, we do associate those risks to the extent that we can with a specific subject matter or risk owner within the organization. And then we sit down and work with them to understand kind of the range of potential variability related to that risk. We know there's a fundamental assumption, the way we hope and expect the future will play out, right? But we know that it could go better or it could go worse. And so we try to work with them to understand how much worse it could get, how much better it might be, depending on how the specifics of that risk event are realized. And so based on like the example that I used, we might say, we might lose 100,000 members. Well, if we lose 100,000 members, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for pricing? What does it mean for our expense base? How are we going to respond to that as a leadership group? And then we can take those assumptions and we can put those into our risk model, and we can shock effectively our baseline strategy assumptions and see whether or not it's something we believe we can withstand, or whether more specifically it's within the tolerances of our risk appetite. And so we do that by trying to quantify even those types of risks that most organizations probably look at qualitatively. We try to look at them and convert them into something that can be modeled quantitatively within our structure. And that, honestly, it pushes sometimes against the limits of our folks' comfort. It's hard to get people sometimes to guess about the future, to guess about how bad it might be, or to even project how good it might be. Because if I go out there with that forward-looking projection of a rosy future, what if we don't hit it? Am I going to be held accountable for that projection? How's that going to look? What's that going to be? And so it's important to create an environment with your leadership where they feel comfortable sharing those perspectives and can do it with a degree of candidness and with a safe playing field, a sandbox, if you will, where they understand we're trying to understand the directional impact of those things.
So as you're talking about the value-based approach of looking at your baseline strat plan and then looking at risk both up and down in terms of scenarios around that, I want to, if you could share a little bit of the story with the audience that you and I shared at that conference a while back, when you first started adopting it. As you mentioned, when we asked about impetus, you mentioned there was a lot of turbulence in the healthcare industry in the United States in terms of just regulation. Where was the landscape going to be? And my reaction was, well, to do this, you have to know where your baseline plan is. I don't know how you plan when there's massive earthquakes and tornadoes around, even where the plan will be, because you don't know where the government will settle in terms of the entire landscape. And it was, and you did it successfully. I kind of make the analogy of like the degree of difficulty in a dive in the Olympics. That was probably the most challenging. And if it can be done then in the environment you were in, it can really be done in any time. So can you share just a little bit about the challenge and how you face that?
Well, I like your diving analogy. I have to confess, we splashed a fair amount along the way when we went into the water. I mean, ultimately, the challenge, even in a turbulent environment, is to set something of a rudder that says, ultimately, this is the direction that we'd like to press. We recognize there's ambiguity around those assumptions, and there may be things that will change, but that's part of the reason why even a strategy that you set has a likelihood. And why you acknowledge going into it that our overall goal is the long-term future success of the organization and the members that we serve. It's not about hitting the exact mark of the strategy. As one of the things, you mentioned your chosen profession is that of an actuary. I have an opportunity to work alongside a very good comrade of mine who is our chief actuary inside our organization. And, over time, one of the challenges that he's always faced in his role as chief actuary is making projections about year-end forecast results, or about what's going to happen here, what's going to happen there. And there was a time when they would zero in on a particular number and say, we think it's going to be right around there. And through the ERM process, interestingly enough, we've changed that narrative. And now they actually speak in terms of ranges of likelihood relative to where we might land. And it creates a different conversation with leadership even, because now the strategy becomes directional. It doesn't become hard and fast. And it gives you the flexibility and a little bit more latitude in being bold in terms of setting strategy and executing, when you recognize there's a reasonable range of outcome that you're trying to achieve, and just being slightly above or slightly below it may not necessarily be a good or a bad thing. The real question is have you been able to effectively manage and predict some of those uncertainties to the extent that you've been able to navigate the waters? And so in our industry, very turbulent. And we set a course, but we knew going in it was going to be the environment was going to be uncertain. And so going into that, knowing that gives you a little bit more freedom to think and plan and prepare for a lot of different possibilities. And then ultimately you're more prepared when you actually get to the present of that future and you see kind of what you're facing.
That's a great segue into my next question for you, which is, do you talk about what types of decisions are informed by the ERM program? Many traditional ERM programs that rely more on COSO ERM, look at risk. They have a top 10 heat map. They've got color coding reports. They go to the board. They update it fairly, periodically. But there's not a lot of major business decisions informed by that. Can you talk about the dynamic nature of your approach, how it works, why it works, and what specifically are you doing in terms of integrating its strategic planning, strategic and tactical decisions like that?
That is a good question. All cards on the table. It's been a maturing process for us. It's taken us time to learn the taxonomy, to learn the language, to mature the organization to the point to where leadership was comfortable coming with strategic alternatives and asking questions, and ultimately coming and saying, can we put that through the risk model? Now, the first time I heard that question, I knew we'd crossed a line, because now all of a sudden it wasn't just a tool where we were throwing a heat map, and I'm sorry, don't get me started on heat maps. I'm not a fan. As our process, we don't use heat maps. And part of that is because I don't approach risk from the standpoint of categories. All right, I understand that there are categories of risks out there, and we have a taxonomy like most organizations, but we use that mostly to help guide and inform and keep people's perspective and viewpoint broad. But when it comes to defining risk, we ask them to think in terms of deterministic scenarios. Let's talk about what could actually happen to the organization. I've used this example. I could go to the board with a beautiful heat map that has red, yellow, and green dots around categories like legal risk. And they would say, oh, legal risk is high. And I would say, yep, legal risk is high. We're in a litigious environment, lots of stuff going on. And they'd go, yep, that makes sense. High risk. I don't know what you do with that. But if I come back to you and I say, we have a specific concern from a legal perspective, this is what we're watching, this might actually happen. And if it does, we have to be prepared for what those outcomes would be. That becomes actionable. That becomes something that I can anticipate from a contingency and a mitigation development standpoint. I can address something that actually might happen. And when you begin to get into that, ultimately, there are schools of thought that go both directions versus, deterministic scenarios versus stochastic modeling and all those sorts of things. But for us, in our implementation, it was more important to make those events real and actionable for our leaders and for our board. And so as a result of that, when we're talking about a model that's shocking our strategy based on specific events, it makes it easier for people to see and visualize how strategic alternatives can be put into the model, and you can see specific projections of possible future outcomes based on that, because it's not just a categorical discussion, it's about real life. And from that perspective, that's been at least successful for us, the way our organization's culture operates.
I want to ask you about risk appetite, because this is one of the major challenges most ERM programs have. They have a very fuzzy, qualitative, wordy description of it, which is really effervescent. It doesn't really relate to ERM. It's more than the kind of businesses that we're in, and maybe some investment guidelines for limits, because that's what they have. And ERM experts vary all over the place in what they think with lots of stuff. But this is one area where most ERM experts agree that there's very few very good risk appetite statements that define it in a quantitative way that can be used in the risk governance process. Can you talk about your approach?
So risk appetite, defining that for us was also a challenge, just like any organization. I mean, be very upfront. We had not defined a formal statement. We had not really thought about what our risk appetite was. And part of the struggle with that is that it's sometimes difficult to know what your risk appetite is until you're facing an event, until you're in the throes of it. The not just the logical thought process, but the emotion and the stress and those different things that are associated with that really bring out what your true appetite is. But from an ERM perspective, you need to put a definition around it so that you can both understand, evaluate, and begin to refine what you believe your organization is willing to tolerate. And so we took the approach of taking time to refine it. We did define a risk appetite statement at the beginning, and we did it in a quantified way. We did it using a metric that was both appropriate for our industry, but also one that our leadership was comfortable with and our board was comfortable with, something that resonated with them. Because of that, they could look at that, they could consume it, they could understand it, and they could challenge their gut and say, does that actually make sense to us? And so we defined it in terms of our ability into the future to maintain a certain level of risk-based capital, which for the insurance industry is a measure of the specific risk in our insurance portfolio and the different risks within the business, investments, et cetera. That is a regulatory measure that's expressed in terms of multiples of your capital position, right? And so our risk-based capital might be 800%, which means we have 8 times the capital amount necessary to cover the baseline calculation of risk that's been included in that particular measure. So we did that, but we wrote it in pencil. We did that very intentionally so that we had a big eraser too. We had a big gum eraser that we held on to over here right next to us, because we knew that as we went forward, as we challenged our own sensibilities, as we got comfortable with the process and the program, and we got comfortable with the measure itself that we had defined, we might need to alter that. Or there might be events within the industry that might shift our appetite. Suddenly we aren't as comfortable with certain tolerances. We're not a for-profit. We're a not-for-profit, okay? And that's pretty important when you think about a risk appetite, because shareholders, stockholders are always thinking about where is that where's that income coming from? Where's that dividend going to be? As a not-for-profit, as a mutual, you're looking at your capital position and you're saying to yourself, how is our capital foundation allowing us to ensure that we're able to cover the risk and the future claims that might be out there for our members? And they expect us to fold that back into affordability of prices for our products, lower premiums. I mean, that's without question a challenge for our industry. And so extraordinary profitability is not what a not-for-profit's looking for. And so you actually have an upside risk relative to capital as well as downside. So, we defined that in a way that we could then monitor how our program unfolded, how we identified risks, and how those risks as a whole influenced the variability into the future around that risk-based capital metric. Now, the question that came from that is, that's good at a global level, but what about at an individual risk level? And so, is it possible that you're in your tolerances globally, but we're busting out of our tolerances on one particular risk that's in the makeup of our portfolio, and we're just not seeing it, and maybe we're not responding to it the way we want to? And so we actually have a secondary level now that we've developed over time, where we, at an individual risk level, look at plus or minus a certain percentage off of our strategic projection for RBC, risk-based capital, for each individual risk. That way, we're able to look at risk globally for our overall appetite, but then we're able to look at individual risks and make sure that we're at that next level down, staying in line with our expectations. I don't know if that's on point with where you wanted me to go.
Spot on.
Okay.
So you got risk appetite and the other layer of it, risk limits on sub-enterprise exposure. So thank you for that. You've already talked, it's been a great overview of your program. And you already talked about this a little bit, mentioned a number of successes, but are there any other successes that you've had in your ERM program that you can highlight for our audience?
So I will tell you that one of the biggest successes early on was the degree to which our chief executive officer was a cheerleader for our program, and the degree to which our board was engaged, was willing to engage, I should say. And after the very first presentation we did to the board in 2017, after that presentation, we had individual board members that came up to us afterward and expressed their appreciation, and they were very excited to continue to see how the process was going to unfold, how we were going to view risk, and how we were going to talk to them about our perspectives on a wider range of risks other than just those that they had historically been exposed to. And that was very refreshing, and they were very engaged by that. And so that's one thing. I would also say that the degree to which our leadership over time has been willing to learn and has begun to change the way they think. And I think that's really the implication on the culture of the organization. And, I think historically we always tended to think in terms of next year, right? We would think in terms of the tactical budget for, in this particular case, this year for 2022. Let's just think about what might happen in 2022. And I want to make sure that, what's the real risk? The real risk is I don't get my budget approved. I mean, that's really the real risk that operations leadership is out there thinking. How can I get my work done if I don't get my budget approved? But ultimately, the budget is just an outcome. If you're thinking in terms of risks and you're thinking in terms of responses and strategies, and you're building a plan that's responsive to that isn't just considering the next year, but it's considering a 3-year horizon or a 5-year horizon, and getting them to begin to think much more actively about that. And that's where one of the things we've been able to do in particular this year. I've had the opportunity to begin to lead pieces of our strategic planning process, and be able to really infuse the information from our ERM approach, our program, our methodology, into the strategic assumptions, so that folks have those in mind, that they're central to their thought process as they're developing what our future key initiatives are going to be, so that they're both responsive to the risks that are out there, but at the same time are aligned. Part of my old background from my former life earlier in my career at Blue Cross was in TQM and Malcolm Baldrige. And so to that end, I'm a student of W. Edwards Deming, and also what he referred to and what we've adopted as the golden thread. And that's where I think ERM, strategic planning, budgeting, and ultimately internal audit, oddly enough. I am the chief audit executive. At the same time, I'm the chief risk officer. And so if you really want your audit group to benefit the board, make sure they know what the processes are that are key to managing strategic risk. I mean, that's where the real rubber meets the road. Financial statement accuracy is table stakes. It's a given. You got to have that. I was with KPMG for 5 years before I came to Blue Cross. I did a lot of auditing for financial statements. Usually that didn't change the world a whole lot. Okay. But ultimately, we spend so much time in internal audit focused on financial controls. I think we don't always put the right emphasis and focus on those processes, controls, outcomes, because remember, controls are simply there to help a process achieve its objective. And so to that end, let's make sure we're focusing on those processes that contribute to strategic success. That's what the board wants to know.
Yeah, I had a long list of questions here. I think in the interest of time, let me jump to if you could share what your approach is to communicating on ERM to regulators.
To our regulators? Oh, goodness. Hopefully most are familiar with the Own Risk and Solvency Assessment Summary Report. That's a long, we call it the ORSA in the insurance industry. It's our regulatory requirement for our regulators to tell them what our ERM process is, what our key risks are, and how we are managing those risks in a way that we can ensure solvency for our organization. And so we developed the ORSA report as a product of our ERM methodology. This was a new requirement for our industry, for regulators. And as we've gone over the last 3 to 4 years in particular, there have been a lot of different approaches to how different insurance carriers have developed their ORSA reports and communicated to their regulators. We really wanted to get out there in front of it. So we actually contacted our state regulator, our insurance department, and talked with them in advance. They were pleased to be able to talk to us about that. And we've gotten some feedback from them early on. But in the last 2 years, interestingly enough, we've spent a grand total in 2 different sessions of 6 solid hours with our regulators and with their counterparts nationally from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, some of the experts from the national space who had reviewed our ORSA report and reviewed our methodology and our approach and our risk makeup. And they asked us if we would spend time with them. And so over the last 2 years, we've spent 2 3-hour sessions with our regulators and our regulators, interestingly enough, talking about our ERM approach. And that has been both eye-opening for us and I hope eye-opening for them, because we take a very different approach. And I think they have, after we worked them through our approach and our thought process, they understood what we were trying to accomplish and achieve. I think they were very favorable in terms of how they viewed our approach. They provided some great feedback in terms of what we were communicating and how we were communicating. But they originally come to it from the standpoint of like a rating agency. They come at it from the standpoint of a regulatory perspective of big categories of risk. And so from our perspective, talking about deterministic scenarios and not really being able to provide a heat map, which, by the way, they really wanted a heat map, because that's easy to consume, right? And it's easy to put that into categories of risk and align. So we took time in our ORSA report to help crosswalk our deterministic approach and scenarios to how they viewed risk, to help them understand and crosswalk our methodology to what they were trying to achieve. And that helped them advance their thinking and get comfortable with our approach. My guess is that we're probably going to do this on an annual basis going forward. And I really like and appreciate the chance to get to have this open dialogue with our regulators, because not only does it help us improve, but hopefully we can also encourage them to think a little differently.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something that we talk a lot about in our master's degree. I explained, the reason that I founded it was I found weaknesses in the traditional methods, value-based works, and then to give folks the communication skills to move people in that direction. And it has, pushed COSO or ERM in the direction of value-based and the redo of it to a degree. It's an emerging approach. So as regulators become more aware of it, they advance what they require of others. They see what's possible, the practicality of it. I also like that you mentioned, you have your approach, and it's important when you communicate to external stakeholders to understand their perspective, and then to map the communication so they don't think you're missing something. If the terminology is different, if the way of thinking is different, they do want to see what you're doing, but they need to understand how in their language, and the onus is on the organization, make sure that the external stakeholder understands that. We have the course external stakeholder requirements to talk about that. We talk about that in a number of settings, including the capstone.
I appreciate you mentioning that. From a leadership perspective, my personal opinion, and this may not be on topic, but my personal opinion is that a good leader operates in a way that they're shifting how they're communicating with the audience that they're interacting with. Rather than requiring or asking the audiences to always shift to how they choose to communicate. To me, that's a really important point, whether it's interacting with the board, interacting with leadership within a company, or whether it's interacting with our regulators. It's critical that they understand in their terms how we operate. And the only way we can effectively convey that is if we take the time to understand the thought processes and the approaches and the foundations from which they're coming, so that it's like active negotiation. The only way that you win-win in active negotiation, if you also understand what the individual you're negotiating with needs to achieve in order to be successful. And as a result of that, you can come to a win-win rather than a win-lose.
Let me ask now, what advice do you have for our students and graduates entering the risk management field?
So right off the bat, I'll tell you, this was not my chosen field when I graduated. I didn't know I was going to end up where I am, but I will tell you that the last 5 years have remade me professionally. I'm in a completely different role, and I think in a completely different way today than I did 5 years ago. Obviously the technical background is table stakes, right? And you mentioned, Sim, your chosen field as an actuary, actuarial science, or the sciences that are fundamental backgrounds to risk-based thinking, and the tools and the capabilities necessary are fundamental. And to me, that's the ticket to the table to begin to have the discussion. For me, it's all about interpersonal skills. I'll be honest with you. You spend, as you mentioned earlier, we talked about, you spend more time interacting with leadership than you do interacting with the risk model. You spend more time understanding and communicating. You have to spend an inordinate amount of time listening. And that is a discipline. Because, I think everyone could probably tell just from our interactions, I talk a lot. And sometimes I have to kind of put a rein on myself relative to how long I go and the things that I say, because if you don't interrupt me, I can go for about a half an hour. So having the discipline to sit and listen and comprehend what people are saying without immediately thinking about a rebuttal or immediately thinking about trying to bring them to your line of thinking or your view or perspective is really critical. Another thing that I will say, I didn't realize this at the beginning of the process, and this may be generational as well, so forgive me if I'm kind of stepping on toes, but documentation and the ability to effectively document is a vital skill. I didn't realize how important it was until we started capturing this huge amount of information and thought and process and perspective from our leadership. How important it was to capture the nuances, to actively listen and be able to translate that, and then for your risk model to be able to assimilate that in a way that you've documented the assumptions and you can articulate that in an effective way in written form. I'm concerned that that is becoming something of a lost art. And so, I'm very hopeful. We're texting. We're great with thumbs, right? I'm not that technologically advanced myself. I'm fortunate my mic or my camera didn't go off this morning. I've been lost. But documentation and being able to capture that in an effective way is a very important skill.
Thank you for mentioning that. And I hope all of our students and grads are listening, because that's something that we emphasize a lot. When we refresh, summarize what we've heard you say. You got to have the right technical approach. That's all great. It's table stakes. It gets you to the table. What you really need are communication skills, active listening skills, being able to translate that into the correct information and reflect it back. We talk a lot about this. I mean, occasionally I'll have someone ask me, "Oh, I want to do these. I want to do the value based on my own, and can you give me the script for the interviews?" And I say, "Well, there is no script. It's dynamic." And I tell my classes too, because my employees at Symmetry will say it's like a dance. Every single interaction is different, because it has to be. You have to understand who you're meeting with, what their language is. As you said, meet people where they are, not where you don't train people. Hey, this is what I talk about. You have to understand how they come at you. You have to have one foot in their world. Listen, you have to have your other foot sort of in the model, understanding what you need. So ask the right questions and to build that bridge. And as you said, you got to document it, reflect it back to make sure it's correct, because there is a lot of nuances in it. And I hope everyone appreciates what it is you're saying, is that you can misunderstand pretty easily. And you need to build those bridges effectively. Did I capture correctly what you were?
You did. It's also simply a form of respect, of honoring the time that your leaders are giving you and the perspectives that they're giving you to capture and provide those nuances, and make sure with them that you're capturing it the way that they believe they said it, the way they intended it to be said. Part of it is also just the whole notion of, if you want to continue to build on that communication, that candidness, and the trust factor that you're building with them, you have to honor what they're saying, and you have to be true to it. And so to that end, if you want that conversation to continue, it's all part of the package.
Thank you. With the few minutes we have left, I'd like to ask anyone to post questions in the Q&A, and we'll pose them to Philip. Let's see what we have. So one question is, how frequently does your organization quantify risks or change the assessment of key risks?
That's a really good question, actually. So one of the things we've been working toward in our overall risk portfolio is, and this is kind of a Southern term, we want to avoid fruit basket turnover. Okay, and what I mean by that is as you mature your risk portfolio and how you're articulating them, you hope that you are refining them to the point to where you're not seeing them change in a wholesale way, year over year. But in our particular industry right now, we talked about how turbulent things have been. The risk landscape can change very quickly. And so to that end, we have to kind of balance those things that we believe fundamentally change or could fundamentally change our strategy, versus those that may simply change how we're responding to certain risk scenarios. So we change our quantification and some of those different things as we see different factors adjusting in industry, as we see different factors move. So that could be pretty fluid. It could happen throughout the year at any given point if you're keeping communication throughout the year. And this is a point. This process is not, you do it in 6 weeks in November, and then you create a binder, and then you put it on the shelf, and you get back to it the next November. It's an active process that you're doing and working throughout the year. And so if you're staying in communication with your risk owners and asking them, hey, has anything changed? Has there been fundamental movement? Has your appetite changed? As a result of that, you might end up changing their assumptions and adjusting the quantifications or changing the likelihoods of different scenarios because the environment has suddenly changed. Perfect example, just in the last few weeks, you've begun to hear more about some of the material infrastructure bills coming out of the federal government and the potential in one of those particular plans for lowering the age of Medicare eligibility from 65 to maybe 60. That's a significant potential change within our industry for private insurance carriers in terms of their, okay, so are you in tune with that? And when you see that, are you picking up the phone and you're calling the people that are associated with those particular risks and the exposures and saying, what do you think about that? How is this impacting us? What do you see this means for our scenarios? So it happens in our organization with maybe a quarterly cadence if we're not seeing things happen in the environment. But if we see things happen in the environment, it's also fluid, and I'll pick up the phone at any given point and challenge the assumptions.
Thank you. I think that is a really critical point to the success of the ERP program, is the ability to have something that's nimble, practical, and focused on the key elements so that you can update it dynamically. It's essentially dynamic strategic planning, as you said, and that's when you get an answer from someone, oh, annually we update. Well, you're dead, because then it's not dynamic. It's not reflecting what's really going on. It really isn't, and you're able to be there right at the moment to inform any decision that the organization is about to make.
There was a day in the insurance industry when there were a very small set of fundamental products that were offered. And you had one basic actuarial metric that everyone was concerned about at the end of the year. And that's what we call IBNR, incurred but not reported claims. Claims that have already happened. People have seen the doctor, but we've not received the claim yet. So we have a liability out there, but we don't know exactly how much it is. And so actuaries have to make that estimate annually. Today, IBNR is an afterthought because there are so many judgments and estimates and so many different ambiguous factors that are present within our environment that our actuarial staff have to respond to, that it's just, you can't go just 1 year at a time. You have to be much more sensitive to the nuances throughout the period.
I'd like to just close with this last question. What do you find the most rewarding in your role as CRO?
Well, I was serious earlier when I said that becoming the CRO and what I've done over the past 5 years has remade me as a professional. I do not think the same way. I don't look at the world the same way, simply because I've conditioned myself to think much more actively about risk and about the implications. And so I'm much more a student of the world environment. I'm much more a student of the national landscape. I'm much more a student of the states, our local and state landscape, in terms of how political factors and other things are moving and shaking within the environment, because those things could have a material influence on our organization, whether we realize it or not. And that doesn't necessarily play out in the form of a financial statement audit. Okay. And so to that end, it's made me think differently, and that's been a huge growth for me. Getting to work very closely with all of our organization's leaders, being in their offices, having those interactions and that movement and that shaking from the standpoint of the nimbleness of the process and all the things that we're dealing with is very exciting, and is very motivating for me as I'm in the last probably 10 years of my career. I just turned 55. And so outside of being able to get a senior coffee at McDonald's now, I'm looking at what the future holds and how the remainder of my career is going to pan out. The other thing is helping the organization. I talked about this earlier. Is helping the organization simulate pain and helping them see potential risk events in a different way, so that we are better insulated, prepared, or actively managing and taking advantage of opportunities that risks create. And so to that end, having that opportunity, being able to support the organization in such a broad way, it's really kind of re-energized me in my career at this stage. And that has been one of the most rewarding things for me. They say you reinvent yourself career-wise 3 or 4 times, maybe 4 or 5 times throughout. This is probably my last formal recreation of myself from this perspective, but it probably will influence how I view the world for the rest of my life.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're out of time for today, but I want to thank you for taking the time to share a peek into your ERM program and your experience. And I want to thank all of those joining us today. Thanks so much.
It's been my honor. Thank you for letting me join.